A lot of people think that red flags are obvious. They think it's always screaming, cheating, lying, explosive behavior. And sometimes it is. But some of the biggest red flags I ignored in my own life were a whole lot quieter than that. And I think that's why they're dangerous. Because when something slowly becomes normal, you stop seeing it clearly, especially when you care about somebody. I know for me, there were a lot of things I explained away for too long because I was trying to see the good in people. And I don't even just mean relationships anymore. I mean people in general. Friends, dating, family, coworkers, just anybody. And I think once you've lived through enough emotional chaos, you start realizing how many warning signs you ignored because you wanted connection more than truth. That was a hard realization for me because after much soul searching, I started realizing there were moments deep down where something in me knew things weren't right long before I was willing to fully face it or even admit it. But I kept trying to rationalize behavior instead of paying attention to how it made me feel. And honestly, something else hit me later in life too. I realized these kinds of personal traits existed around me long before my marriage ever happened. We just didn't have language for it back then. Growing up, I had an uncle that I really looked up to. And honestly, a lot of us did. He was charismatic, funny, confident, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention. And growing up, we all kind of put him on a pedestal. But as I got older, I started noticing things. You know, Everything somehow always became about him. The ego, the manipulation, the way people around him always seemed emotionally drained after a while. And the older I got, the more I watched it slowly destroy his own family. His marriage, his relationships with people, the tension, the emotional damage that followed him everywhere. And back then, we didn't call it narcissism. Honestly, most people didn't even use words like that. People just said, that's how he is. Or, he's difficult. He's proud. He likes attention. And I think that's one reason a lot of us missed red flags as adults, too. Because a lot of these unhealthy behaviors were normalized around us growing up. Sometimes we were raised around emotional instability without realizing just how unhealthy it actually was. So later in life, when we experience manipulation, walking on eggshells, constant emotional unpredictability, part of us already recognized that as familiar. Not healthy, familiar. And there's a huge difference between those two things. That realization hit me like a truck after my marriage failed and life stripped me down and left me broken from that abuse. Because once everything collapsed, I finally stopped looking at individual moments and started actually looking at patterns. And honestly, that's when I started connecting dots all the way back into my childhood. Because once you finally see these behaviors clearly for what they are, you can't unsee them anymore. And honestly, that was uncomfortable because you realize, just how many things you normalized for years simply because you grew up around them. I think a lot of people do that without realizing it. Especially good-hearted people, especially people who hate conflict. And now we're learning a word for some of this too. People call it being an empath. Well, maybe there's truth to that. And maybe, well, no, not maybe, but honestly, I think a lot of it connects back to the same kind of early life that I'm talking about. Because when you grow up around emotional instability, you become highly aware of other people's emotions. You learn to read moods early, tone changes, energy shifts, facial expressions. You learn how to keep the peace. And you learn how to avoid conflict. You learn how to emotionally adapt to unstable people around you. And later in life, that can make you extremely vulnerable to narcissistic relationships without even realizing it. Because a lot of empaths, or whatever people want to call it, aren't just compassionate people. Sometimes they're people who were emotionally conditioned early in life to focus on everybody else before themselves. And honestly, that hit me really hard once I started understanding it. You keep telling yourself, they're just stressed, they didn't mean it, they've been through a lot, they'll calm down, it's probably me. And after enough time, you stop trusting your own instincts completely. That changes you. I know it changed me. One of the biggest red flags that I pay attention to now is how somebody handles accountability. Because healthy people can have hard conversations without trying to destroy you personally. That took me a long time to understand. If every disagreement immediately becomes blame, insults, guilt, manipulation, or just turning everything back on you, that's not healthy communication. And I think a lot of people normalize that behavior because it happens slowly over time. You get conditioned to it. You start preparing emotionally before conversations even happen. You know, you're rehearsing what you're going to say in your own head. Trying to say things the right way so the other person doesn't react badly. That's exhausting. And honestly, I didn't fully realize how unhealthy that was until I finally stepped away from it. Because peace changes your perspective. When your nervous system finally calms down, you start realizing just how much tension you were living with every single day before that. Another red flag I notice now is inconsistency. Not perfection, not bad days. We all have those. I'm talking about people who constantly shift emotionally in ways that make you feel unstable around them. One day they appreciate you, the next day they treat you cold. One day they want closeness, the next day they pull away completely. One day you feel valued, the next day you feel like a burden. That emotional unpredictability messes with people more than they even realize. Because after enough time, you stop feeling emotionally safe. You start walking on eggshells without even noticing that you're doing it. And I think people underestimate what that does. You know, to somebody psychologically over years. You become hyper aware, hyper vigilant, always reading moods, facial expressions, tone changes. You start, monitoring the emotional environment constantly. And eventually, you don't even know how to relax anymore. That's not love. That's survival mode. And another thing I pay attention to now is how somebody talks about everybody else. Because eventually people reveal themselves in patterns. If somebody constantly paints themselves as the victim in every story, pay attention to that. If everybody from their past was supposedly, crazy or a villain, pay attention to that. If somebody tears other people down constantly, eventually that energy catches you too. I had to learn that the hard way. And honestly, I think a lot of us ignore those flags because we see people's potential instead of their patterns. That's a dangerous mistake sometimes. You know, Potential will keep you stuck in situations your reality should have already pulled you out of. I know it did for me. I kept thinking if they heal, if things calm down, if we communicate better. Meanwhile, I was becoming emotionally drained, trying to hold everything together. And one other thing I've learned later in life is this. You cannot build peace with somebody who thrives in emotional chaos. It just doesn't work. And I think some people spend years trying to earn basic emotional safety from people who simply aren't capable of giving it. it you know, Especially consistently. That realization hurts, you know, especially when you genuinely loved them, especially when you built your life around them, especially when you kept hoping the good moments would eventually outweigh the bad ones. But eventually, really catches up emotionally. Your body starts telling the truth that your mind keeps trying to avoid. That's where the exhaustion starts. The anxiety, the tension, the emotional confusion, and honestly, I think that's why I noticed red flags so differently now. Not because I became cold, not because I hate people. I just value peace differently, after losing so much of it. I pay attention now to how people make me feel constantly. Anybody can be amazing when things are easy. Pay attention to people during a disagreement. Stress, frustration, boundaries, hard conversations. That tells you a lot more about them. And another thing I learned the hard way, real connection should not require you to slowly abandon yourself. You shouldn't constantly feel emotionally drained trying to maintain closeness with somebody. You shouldn't feel anxious every time your phone goes off wondering what mood they're in. You shouldn't have to shrink yourself to avoid conflict all the time. And honestly, I think a lot of people later in life finally reach a point where they're just tired of the emotional chaos. I know I did. You start realizing peace is worth protecting, not because you're weak, but because you finally understand what it costs when you lose it. And I think once somebody has truly lived through emotional instability long enough, they stop ignoring certain things forever. Not because they become judgmental, but because experience changed what they tolerate. I know it changed me. There are things I once explained away that immediately stand out to me now. Not because I think I'm perfect, I know I'm not, but because I've seen what happens when you ignore your instincts for too long. And honestly, I think a lot of people watching this right now know exactly what I mean. Because deep down, most people felt the red flags long before they admitted them to themselves. They just hoped they were wrong. I know I did. Now, let me ask you guys something. What's the red flag that you'll never ignore again after what you've been through? Let me know in the comments. And for those of you that are new here, my name is Ron, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.